I mean, that makes women interrupt my bathroom.
JJ, you in a gang?
No, Ma, they chose me. I didn't choose them.
We were never friends. We never talked. If you said at that time, call Esther and ask her about, I wouldn't even have her number.
All right, let's get into it. You know Jimmie Walker as the guy who brought us Dyn-o-mite on Good Times, right? But after the show wrapped, his career took a pretty rough turn. Trust me, what happened next is way sadder than you might think.
It's just, who are you? You're just like the fifth guy in the show. You just shut up.
Stick around. This one's a real eye-opener.
Here I am!
Jimmie Walker, born and raised in Brooklyn in the Bronx, didn't always have Hollywood on his radar. He went to Theodore Roosevelt High in NYC, and after that, he kept it local, diving into a New York State program called Seek. This helped him get into radio engineering, landing a gig at WRVR. And get this, before comedy took over, Walker was hustling as a vendor at Yankee Stadium during the 1964 World Series. Talk about an iconic start. By 1967, he was working full-time at WRVR, but in '69, he switched gears to comedy.
I wanted Jimmie Walker. No, he sucks, man. It's not funny. So Brenner and Bet and Steve Landsberg went to him at the bar and said, you're not going to drink here anymore, and you're not going to be here anymore if you don't put Jimmie Walker on the show.
After popping up on shows like Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In and The Jack Paar Show, he caught the eye of the Good Times casting director.
What are the cultural advantages of being brought up in the ghetto?
You learn how to use a lot of culinary equipment such as knives.
The rest, history. His stand-up album Dyn-o-mite dropped during his Good Times peak and became a hit, thanks to his hilarious catchphrase. Speaking of Dyn-o-mite, that wasn't just his thing. Jimmie credits Good Times producer John Rich for pushing him to say it in every episode, even though both Jimmie and Norman Lear were pretty unsure at first. But like any classic catchphrase, it caught on, and the rest is sitcom legend. Oh, and fun fact, Walker's character was a lot younger than him. In fact, John Amos, who played his dad on the show, was only 8 years older than him. Good Times is one of those sitcoms that became a true TV classic when it aired from 1974 to 1979. Created by Eric Monte and Mike Evans and produced by the legendary Norman Lear, it broke major ground by showcasing an African-American family living in a Chicago housing project. It wasn't just about laughs, it tackled real issues like struggles in the Black community. What made the show stand out was its perfect mix of real-life struggles and humor. The Evans family dealt with their personal issues but always found a way to make it funny while sticking to strong family values. But behind the scenes, not everything was as smooth as it seemed on screen. Jimmie's character, J.J. Evans, became a fan favorite thanks to his iconic catchphrase, Dyn-o-mite. But that same catchphrase, while beloved by audiences, caused some tension on set. Esther Roll wasn't thrilled with how much attention was being given to J.J. and his one-note character. She actually took a brief break from the show in 1976 because of it. On top of that, John Amos wasn't happy with how his character was being treated either. He was written out entirely. That was a huge shift for the show, and fans definitely felt the change. Let's get into it.
I will honestly say, I don't remember ever speaking a word to Esther the whole time she was there. I think the same basically goes for John.
Jimmie's time on Good Times wasn't exactly the picture-perfect sitcom family behind the cameras. Sure, the show was a major hit and still holds a special place in TV history, but Walker has made it pretty clear that things were tense off-screen. In his usual blunt style, he's admitted that the cast didn't click in real life. His standout quote? Something along the lines of, "We weren't close. We barely even talked." So much for all that on-screen chemistry, huh?
We were never friends. We never talked. If you said at that time, call Esther and ask her about, I wouldn't even have her number.
Jimmie's big confession just puts a spotlight on how disconnected he really was to the Good Times cast. His over-the-top J.J. Evans, with that unforgettable Dyn-o-mite energy, made him a household name. But not everyone was laughing. John Amos and Esther Roll, who played the show's parents, weren't thrilled about the spotlight shifting to Joey's over-the-top humor. They had hoped the show would tackle real issues about black family life in America, not lean into slapstick comedy. Let's just say the behind-the-scenes dynamics weren't exactly picture-perfect. The drama on the Good Times set wasn't just about clashing ideas, it ran deeper. Jimmie has painted a pretty clear picture. Work was all business, with zero bonding or team spirit. That disconnect only made things messier. For John Amos and Esther Roll, JJ's over-the-top antics were exactly the kind of stereotypes they were trying to fight with the show's serious themes. They didn't hold back their frustration either, speaking out both on set and off. Eventually, things got so tense that Amos said goodbye to the show after a few seasons. Safe to say, it wasn't all laughs behind the scenes. Jimmie's knack for cracking jokes was a huge part of why Good Times blew up, but it also put the cast's creative differences front and center. Jimmie's always stood by his role, saying he was just doing what he got hired for, bringing the laughs. Simple as that.
Norman loves to do stories. I came in as a comedy kamikaze. I wanted to really just hurt people with laughs.
While the show was becoming a hit, John felt like it was turning into the Jimmie Walker show.
I felt too much emphasis was being put on JJ and his chicken hat and saying Dyn-o-mite every third page, when just as much emphasis and mileage could have been gotten out of my other two children and the concomitant jokes and humor that could have come out of that.
Seriously, it seemed like the entire focus was on J.J. Evans and his Dyn-o-mite catchphrase. While Jimmie was over here getting all the attention, John's character, James Evans Sr., and the rest of the cast were getting pushed to the sidelines. John wanted the show to be more than just laughs, like I said earlier. He was all about diving into serious topics like racism, poverty, and the struggles black families faced. But the producers, not so much. They were more interested in keeping the laughs rolling and the catchphrases flying. As you can imagine, that kind of creative tension didn't sit well with John. He wasn't the kind of guy to keep his feelings to himself, and it didn't help that he wasn't exactly the diplomatic type. The situation got so bad that the producers made the call to just kill off his character. Yep, they straight up wrote James Evans Sr. out of the show with a car accident. Cold, right? One day out of nowhere, John gets a call from Norman Lear's secretary. They tell him Norman wants to talk, and you can imagine how that went down. When John finally got on the phone with Norman, he got the news. The show was coming back for another season, but he wasn't. Norman didn't sugarcoat it. John wasn't coming back. No freak out, no drama, just a quick okay from John, and that was it. He hung up, and just like that, he was out. No more James Evans Sr. on Good Times, and no more calls from Norman Lear. Done.
I wasn't the most diplomatic guy, like I said, in those days, and they got tired of having their lives threatened over jokes.
For John, it wasn't just about losing his job. It was about the show he'd signed up for losing its original purpose. He had big hopes for the series to be a platform for real, thought-provoking stories about social issues. Without James Evans Sr., the Evans family felt incomplete. The producers tried to work around it by writing him out with that car accident storyline, but John's absence was definitely felt. And as for the show itself, some fans will argue it never quite recovered from that decision.
James, there is dignity in all work. It's not the kind of work you do that gives you dignity.
So like I said earlier, the amazing Esther Rolle, who played the iconic mom on Good Times, had some serious thoughts about how JJ's character was shaping up. She also thought JJ was basically turning into a walking stereotype. He's 18, doesn't work, can't read or write, and doesn't think, she pointed out, adding that the show didn't start out like that. Esther was concerned about how this could influence young black viewers. She didn't want them to think they could just coast by, shouting Dyn-o-mite and doing nothing else. Yeah, that kind of portrayal wasn't sitting well with her at all.
You look great. Thank you, Daddy.
Have a nice time, baby.
Bernadette Stannis, Thelma, dropped some real behind-the-scenes tea about Jimmie. Apparently, the guy wasn't the easiest to talk to, Like, he wasn't really about those casual convos with anyone. She also shared this funny moment where she managed to get him to take her out one night. They ended up at a comedy club with some big names like Jay Leno. But instead of paying attention to her, the whole crew spent the night cracking jokes. It was so awkward that Bernadette straight up told Jimmie, "Never again." As for the so-called tension on set, Bernadette said it wasn't about any bad blood. It was more about the way the show was being written. Esther and John wanted the focus to be on family values, but the show kept leaning into JJ's over-the-top moments. Like, in the first season when they had him grabbing stuff that looked suspiciously like stealing? Yeah, Esther and John fought to get those bits changed so the characters didn't come off badly. Meanwhile, Jimmie had his own quirky way of doing things. Bernadette laughed, saying he'd take the flowers sent to her by fans, including some NBA stars, and give them to his girlfriend. She didn't mind, though, thought it was pretty funny. But even with all the on-set drama, Bernadette made it clear that everyone had their own personalities. And despite the disagreements, they were all just trying to make Good Times the best it could be. And I bet Norman Lear, in his own way, wanted the same thing. I mean, it was his show, so he just thought he was doing the best for the show.
The character of JJ in Good Times, played by Jimmie Walker, is now looked at as a caricature. Well, he was anything but a caricature at the beginning. I mean, he was a gifted artist.
Now, when it comes to Jimmie, he had a lot to say about how the show was going too. His relationship with Norman Lear, the creator, wasn't always the smoothest. At the start, Good Times was all about showing the struggles of a black family dealing with real issues like poverty and racism. But as the show progressed, Walker felt that JJ became the main focus, way more than he ever intended. Instead of balancing humor with deeper themes, the show seemed to just lean into JG's jokes and catchphrases. Jimmie wasn't having it, calling his character a caricature instead of a real person.
But too much Dyn-o-mite, 2 years later, is viewed as cliche, not cliche, as a caricature.
Norman, of course, had his own perspective. He was known for blending humor with heavy topics, and he probably saw JJ's comedy as part of that mix. But for Jimmie, it felt like the show lost its depth, turning into a laugh fest instead of using humor to address serious issues. Even though Jimmie stuck around on the show, he didn't keep quiet about his frustrations, making it clear in interviews that he wasn't a fan of the direction it took. He might have stayed, but he definitely wasn't happy with how things were shaking out.
Working, and he mattered in stories that were very serious stories, drugs and alcohol. And he was wonderful. But we allowed him, for the sake of getting those laughs, those easy laughs, to repeat himself too much.
All right, let's dive deeper into Jimmie's first impression of the show and the chaos that followed. So on his very first day on set, he wasn't shy about calling out the script. He was sitting there with a co-star, reading through it, and he straight up muttered, "Man, this sucks. What is this?" His co-star, probably expecting to hear something a bit more positive, just goes, "It's our show." But Jimmie wasn't having it. He then fired off with, "Who wrote this?" This is horrible. No filter at all, right?
Well, the first day, I'm sitting next to this guy, and we're reading the script. And I go, "Man, this sucks. What is this?" And he says, "Well, it's our sitcom show." I said, "Who wrote this? This is horrible." He says, "Yeah, it's kind of what we're doing here."
Next thing you know, Alan Mannings, one of the producers, walks over and asks about Jimmie's feedback. Jimmie, being the stand-up guy that he is, doesn't sugarcoat it. He goes, "Yeah, this thing needs a total rewrite." And Alan, totally unbothered, just says, "Who are you? You're just the fifth guy in the show, so pipe down." To which Jimmie claps back, "Nah, man, you gotta think bigger than this. I'm not just some actor, I'm a comic. You don't know what you're messing with." Jimmie was all about getting his comedic chops in there. Being a stand-up, he felt that he could make things way funnier if they just let him do his thing. But nah, the show's writers were all, "Hold up, this is how it's written. You don't get to just improvise," which made him pretty frustrated. So he would just wait until it was actually time to shoot the scene. That's when he would slip in a zinger or two, low-key forcing the funny, even if the script didn't say so. The producers were like, "Bro, chill. You're not a writer, just stick to acting." But Jimmie, he was like, "You'll see. I'm gonna make this hilarious."
It's just, who are you? You're just like the fifth guy in the show. You just shut up.
Beyond the drama of the set, Jimmie and his buddy downtown Johnny Brown had their own thing going. They weren't just working hard on the show, they were living for those backstage moments. They'd show up to set, and Jimmie would find a chick to impress. He'd grab a rose, hand it to her, and then casually say, "Here, take this, you're welcome." Meanwhile, his co-star Bernadette was getting tons of roses, like an actual bunch of dozens from the Lakers, the Dodgers, and who knows who else. It's clear that the cast had a lot of love to go around, but Jimmie was always a step ahead when it came to making an entrance. But let's be real. The crew that Jimmie really connected with were his fellow comics. He felt like they were the only ones who truly understood his humor. They clicked, and it was all about the laughs, no ego, no drama. It was the kind of bond where you didn't have to compete or be fake, just pure comic energy. Even though there were some major behind-the-scenes tensions, Jimmie and the comics definitely had their own world on set, making the best of a sometimes awkward situation. Jimmie's also got some, let's call it interesting, political views. Jimmie doesn't really fit into any political box. He calls himself a realist independent, meaning he's all about keeping it practical and not getting stuck on one party's side. In interviews, he's made it clear he's not Team Democrat or Republican. Instead, he leans toward a more middle ground, common-sense approach to things, focusing on what actually works rather than sticking to party lines. His take on affirmative action? He's not a fan. He's spoken out about how he thinks it's kind of outdated now. Originally meant to help fix racial inequalities, Jimmie believes it's become more of a crutch than a tool for progress. Instead of pushing people to work hard and earn what they get, he feels it's made some people feel entitled, like they deserve things without putting in the effort. For him, it's all about merit, not handouts. His take on affirmative action definitely raises some eyebrows, especially in the Black community where a lot of people have supported it. But Jimmie's all about doing things his own way. He's a big believer in personal responsibility and hard work, and thinks the government shouldn't be the one to step in and fix things. He's never been shy about being his own man, even if it ruffles some feathers. Jimmie's political views definitely put him in the more conservative or libertarian camp in Hollywood. Talking about ruffling feathers, Jimmie has shared his thoughts on gay marriage, saying he's not personally on board with it because of his own moral beliefs, but he's all for it being legalized. He's made it clear that while he doesn't support it personally, he thinks it's a matter of personal freedom and individual rights. So even though it doesn't line up with his own views, he doesn't think it should be a legal or political battle. Jimmie seems to be big on personal freedom and thinks the government shouldn't be all up in people's business, especially when it comes to personal choices like relationships and marriage. Even though his take on gay marriage might lean more traditional or conservative, he's all about letting people make their own decisions, no matter where he stands on the issue. Jimmie also had some issues with some other notable figures.
Black man ain't got a chance down here. I'm black. Well, you the judge, that don't count.
The drama between Jimmie and Red Foxx on Good Times is one of those behind-the-scenes moments that's just too good not to talk about. Both are legends in their own right, but their comedic styles, totally different, and that created some major tension. Red Foxx was the OG bad boy of comedy. Known for his raw, no-holds-barred humor, he was all about pushing limits and making people squirm with jokes that weren't exactly family-friendly. His work on Sanford and Son made him a household name, with his sarcastic, grumpy Fred Sanford stealing the spotlight. On the flip side, Jimmie's character, J.J. Evans, was all about the energy, optimism, and of course, the famous Dyn-o-mite. His comedy was way more lighthearted and geared towards younger viewers. But that catchphrase? Red Foxx wasn't impressed. He thought Jimmie was leaning too much on it, instead of crafting a deeper, more clever routine. Foxx was all about the sharp, intellectual humor, while Jimmie's style was more fun, goofy, and focused on his character's catchphrases. But it wasn't just a comedy clash. Foxx, being a comedy vet, probably wasn't too thrilled to see Jimmie, a relative newcomer, getting so much attention. Rumor has it, Foxx would throw some subtle shade at Jimmie, which definitely didn't sit well with Jimmie. On the other hand, Jimmie probably thought Foxx was being a bit too harsh, especially since both were big names in the TV game. It was an interesting mix of talent, egos, and different takes on what makes people laugh. On that note, Jimmie's also got some thoughts on Richard Pryor.
Then the police came, I went in the house. Because they got magnums too. And they don't cars.
Jimmie has been pretty open about the tough times he had with Richard Pryor. In interviews, he said that Pryor, being such a big name in comedy, sometimes came off as a bit condescending toward younger comics like him. He felt like Pryor didn't give him the credit he deserved, brushing off his comedy style and abilities. It wasn't just about competition. Jimmie thought it was Pryor's way of showing who was boss in the comedy world. He's talked a lot about how competitive comedy can be, especially when you're a fresh face. He felt like some big-name comics, especially the legends like Pryor, would just look down on new acts or anyone with a different style. Walker didn't exactly love that attitude. He had his own big success on Good Times, but still felt like he wasn't getting the respect he deserved in the comedy scene. Even with all that tension, though, Jimmie's always said Richard Pryor was one of the best to ever do it. He's admitted he was a fan of Pryor's work and recognized how much he changed the game for stand-up comedy. Jimmie also had issues with Johnny Carson. Jimmie's beef with Johnny Carson, one of the most legendary late-night hosts, comes down to a lot of professional frustration and feeling totally brushed off during his appearances on The Tonight Show. Back in the 70s, when Walker was becoming the breakout star of Good Times, he saw the show as a huge chance to show off his comedy chops to a bigger audience. But according to him, those moments often left him feeling underappreciated. His main gripe with Carson? He felt like Carson just didn't treat him like he treated other comedians. Even though Good Times was one of the biggest shows at the time, Carson, who was known for his sharp, sometimes harsh humor, didn't seem to take him seriously. Walker claimed that whenever he went on The Tonight Show, Carson would interrupt his jokes or totally ignore his punchlines. For a comedian trying to break out of their TV persona, this kind of treatment felt like a huge setback. It's like Carson, the guy known for giving comics the stage to shine, wasn't letting Walker do his thing. It didn't help that Carson had his own preferences for what kind of comedy he liked. He was more into traditional stand-up comedy, and Walker's style, based on his Good Times characters' antics and catchphrases, didn't always fit that mold. So it felt like Carson wasn't really acknowledging Walker's comedic skills, adding to his frustration. On top of everything, Walker was aware of the power dynamic. Getting on Carson's show was a big deal. It was basically the key to Hollywood success. But for Walker, it felt like he wasn't getting the same respect or spotlight that other, more established comics got, making the whole thing even worse. And that's a wrap, folks. Jimmie Walker's life after Good Times is one of those Hollywood tales. It's proof that fame doesn't always stick around. If you're into these throwback dives, smash that like button, hit subscribe for more juicy stories, and sound off in the comments. What are your thoughts on Jimmie's roller coaster ride? Catch you in the next one.